It was supposed to be a simple family dinner. Just a cozy evening at my home. I'd set the table myself, linen napkins, wine glasses, a roast that had taken all day. The lights were low and warm. Leo, my 10-year-old son, had been excited all week. He loves when we have company. He's a little whirlwind of stories and imagination, always narrating his day like it's a movie. That night, he'd just finished a joke about his science teacher when it happened. Greg said, "Can you just shut up already?" The words cut through the room like glass. There was a clink of a fork hitting a plate. My mother looked up from her wine glass, startled. My father coughed. Melissa, my sister and Greg's wife, didn't blink. Leo's smile faded. His eyes dropped to his lap. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. Neither was I. I looked across the table at Greg. He didn't look sorry. He didn't even look aware that what he'd said was inappropriate. He just casually sipped his drink like it was the most natural sentence in the world. I said, "Excuse me?" Greg shrugged. Greg said, "I'm just saying, he's been going on and on for 20 minutes. We're trying to eat." I looked at Leo. His little fingers were fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I said, "He's 10. He's excited. You could have asked politely." Greg gave a forced chuckle, then said, "Come on, it's not that serious." It was Melissa who jumped in then, like she always does when Greg says something unacceptable and someone dares to push back. Melissa said, "Don't make this a thing. You know Leo's always loud. Greg's just tired." I turned to her, slowly. My voice didn't rise, my face didn't change. I said, "Tired or not, you don't speak to a child that way, especially not in my house." Greg leaned back in his chair, smirking. Greg said, Well, maybe next time he can learn some manners before hosting a monologue." That was it. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about dinner. This was about respect. About power. About a man who thought he could speak to a child like that and walk away with a smirk. I looked at Leo. He was staring at his plate like it had betrayed him. I placed my hand gently on his back. I said, "You're fine, baby. You were telling a great story." He looked up at me, unsure. Leo said, "Was I being annoying?" I said, "No. You were being you, and there's nothing wrong with that." The rest of the dinner dragged like a weighted coat. The roast went cold. Conversations stayed shallow. Greg didn't speak again, not because he was embarrassed, but because he knew I was watching him now. Melissa didn't meet my eyes. She stayed close to Greg's side, sipping her wine, occasionally tossing glances at me like I was the one who had ruined the night. After dessert, they left quickly. No hugs, no warmth. As I closed the door behind them, Leo asked quietly, "Did I do something bad?" I crouched down so we were eye to eye. I said, "No. You were excited, and kind, and full of light. That's not bad. That's beautiful." He nodded, but his shoulders stayed curled inward, like he was still holding on to shame that didn't belong to him. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed and played the moment over in my head. Greg's tone, Melissa's defense, Leo's shrinking posture. I'd spent years tolerating Greg, laughing off his rude jokes, letting Melissa smooth things over. I kept the peace. I stayed neutral. I didn't start fires. But something changed that night. Because when you see your child flinch from someone's words, when you see them dim their own light because someone else found it too loud, something shifts in you permanently. I wasn't angry. Not in the screaming sense. I was focused. And deep down, I knew something Greg didn't. He thought I was just Leo's mom, just a sister, just a woman who hosted quiet dinners and asked for apologies. But he didn't know who I really was, not yet. And soon, he'd find out. Not with shouting, not with revenge, with structure, with power, with a position he didn't even know I held. And when that moment came, when the roles flipped and the balance shifted, I wouldn't need to raise my voice at all. I'd just have to say exactly what he said. Only this time, it would echo. This wasn't the first time Greg crossed a line. It was just the first time he did it to my son. That's what made it different. But if I'm honest, Greg had been like this since the day he entered our family, dismissive, arrogant, convinced the world owed him space, and the rest of us should be grateful for his opinions. The first time I met him, Melissa brought him to our parents' house during the holidays. He spent the evening droning on about his portfolio, explaining the economy to our father, who worked in finance for 30 years, and interrupting our mother to correct her about something she had actually lived through. "Not to be rude," he said, "but I think what you meant was..." That was Greg's brand. Not to be rude always came before something rude. Melissa just smiled like it was endearing, brushed his arm, and said, "He's just passionate about what he knows." He wasn't passionate. He was loud, and he needed to be the smartest voice in the room, even if he had to talk over someone else to do it. At gatherings, he'd interrupt our younger cousins, correct people mid-sentence, crack jokes at our expense. Once, during my birthday dinner, he said I was surprisingly well-spoken for someone who runs an internal ops team. I raised my eyebrow and said, "I run it because I'm qualified, not because it's cute." He smirked and waved it off. Melissa clinked her glass against his and changed the subject. For years, that was the pattern. He talked down to people, especially women, and Melissa smoothed it over. He just has a strong personality. He doesn't mean anything by it. He's like that with everyone. But he wasn't. He wasn't like that with men he respected. He wasn't like that with bosses or clients, or anyone he feared might actually push back. He was like that with people he thought he could overpower. And for a long time, I stayed silent. I kept the peace. Not because I agreed, but because Melissa looked happy. Or at least convinced herself she was. I told myself it wasn't my place. That speaking up would only make things worse. That maybe I was being too sensitive. But then Leo was born. And everything changed. Leo is bright and curious and unapologetically expressive. He narrates his day like an audiobook, asks questions about everything, and tells you what he's feeling before you even have to guess. He's pure light. And he notices everything. One night, when he was 7, after a barbecue where Greg had spoken over me 3 times in a single conversation, Leo sat quietly in the car, then asked, "Why does Uncle Greg talk to you like you're not smart?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then said, "He always interrupts you. And he said your idea wasn't a real strategy, but you're the boss, right?" I nodded slowly. "He always talks like you don't know stuff," Leo said. "But you do." I didn't respond right away. I just gripped the steering wheel and thought about how many times I had bitten my tongue for the sake of family, and how many times Leo had watched me do it. I realized silence wasn't neutral. It was permission. I started speaking up more after that. Not dramatically, just firmly. I corrected Greg when he talked over people. I refused to laugh when he mocked someone. I looked him in the eye when he made one of his smug remarks. He noticed, and didn't like it. But that dinner, when he told my son to shut up, that was something else. That was the moment the mask dropped. It wasn't just a careless joke or a Greg being Greg moment. It was intentional, sharp, meant to put a child in his place. And Melissa? She didn't flinch, just gave a little laugh, then said, "He's just tired." Don't make it a thing. I stared at her, at the woman I grew up with, The one who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. The one who used to call me after her bad dates and ask what I thought about a guy. Now she sat across from me defending a man who snapped at my child like he was a barking dog. She just laughed, then said, "He's always loud anyway." That's what broke me. Not just Greg's words, but Melissa's silence, her complicity. There's something uniquely painful about watching your own sister excuse the way someone disrespects your child. I didn't yell, I didn't fight. But I felt something shift. All those years of swallowing it down for the sake of dinners and birthdays and holiday photos, gone. Because the moment Greg made my son feel small, he forfeited the benefit of my silence. And the moment Melissa chose to protect her husband's pride instead of her nephew's heart, she forfeited my trust. What they didn't know, what Greg couldn't possibly imagine, was that our lives were about to overlap in a new way. He was about to walk into a place where my authority couldn't be brushed off, where Melissa's excuses wouldn't matter, where no one would laugh politely at his behavior. He was about to enter my world, and this time I wouldn't be biting my tongue. I wish I could say I planned it, that I orchestrated some grand revenge or pulled strings behind the scenes to land this exact moment. But the truth is simpler and more poetic. Greg was scheduled to transfer into a new internal division that formed after a corporate merger between his company and ours. He didn't know which team yet. He just knew he had to show up for orientation on Monday. He didn't know it would be me standing at the front of that room. I'd been promoted the year before, Director of Operations for the consolidated portfolio. 46 employees reported to me directly. The transition had been quiet, internal. There were no LinkedIn announcements, no social media posts, which meant Greg, who never paid attention to anything that didn't involve himself, had no idea I was his new boss. I arrived early that morning, set up the room, checked the sign-in sheets. There were 15 new transfers slotted to start orientation that day. Greg was number 12. When he walked in, he didn't look at me at first. He was too busy talking on the phone. He said, Yeah, I'm at the new office now. Should be easy to move up fast. They've had weak leadership, so I'm hearing anyway." Then he glanced up and froze. For the first time since I'd known him, Greg didn't have something smart to say. He blinked, tilted his head, then gave a stiff little laugh. "Wow," he said, "small world." I smiled, gracefully, warmly, without a trace of personal history. I said, "Welcome to Group 7. Please take a seat." His eyes darted toward the printed schedule on the table in front of him, then to the placard with my name, Director Danielle Reyes. He sat down slowly, quietly. During introductions, I kept it professional. I welcomed the team, outlined expectations, then explained the reporting structure. I said, "For those of you coming from Coreside Tech, you'll now be under the oversight of Group 7 Ops, which I lead. I'll be your director moving forward. Any departmental decisions, team assignments, or leadership evaluations will run through me." Greg looked like he wanted to shrink into his chair. I didn't gloat, I didn't smirk. But I watched as he started to realize that the same woman he'd mocked at family gatherings, the one he'd dismissed as uptight and overly sensitive, the one whose child he told to shut up at the dinner table. She now held the pen that approved his project assignments. He raised his hand about 30 minutes in. "I'm just wondering," he said, "will we still be looped into departmental strategy, or is that locked in already?" It was the tone that made me pause, not the question. He was trying to show he still had control, that he could make this into a conversation between equals. I met his eyes calmly. I said, "You'll be looped in once your team demonstrates readiness to contribute. Until then, I suggest listening." He nodded, jaw tight. I moved on. The rest of the session went by without issue. The other team members were engaged, curious, respectful. I made it clear that I ran my department with collaboration, but also accountability. Greg stayed mostly silent. Every now and then, he'd scribble something down like he was planning his next move. I've seen that look before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, and sadly, in my own family. The look of a man who doesn't like losing power. When the session ended, I stood near the door as the group filed out. "Thank you, Director," one of the women said on her way past. "Excited to be working with you." I smiled. "Likewise." Greg lingered, last out. He tried a half laugh again. "So, how long have you been in this role?" he asked. "Over a year," I said. He nodded slowly, then said, "I'm sure it's been interesting." I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting how?" He looked like he was backpedaling before he even finished the sentence. "Oh, just, juggling family and work. That's gotta be a lot." Ah, there it was, the little dig. I said, "I'm very good at balancing priorities, especially when one of them is leading people who know how to work as a team." He opened his mouth, then closed it. I said, "Have a good first week, Greg." My door is open when you have something worth saying. And I walked away. No grand speech, no mic drop, just structure, authority. A quiet reminder that I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. He had no idea what was coming, but the ground had shifted, and he knew it. Greg talked like every word was a favor, like silence was a gap he was doing us the honor of filling. He didn't talk to contribute. He talked to dominate. That had always been his power. Noise. He wore it like armor. The louder he was, the more people mistook him for confident, competent, impressive. And for years he'd gotten away with it. Because no one wanted to be the one who said, "Actually, you don't know what you're talking about." People tolerated him, avoided conflict. Melissa called it just his personality. But now he was in my domain, and here, noise wasn't power. Performance didn't get you promoted. You had to actually produce something. It was a Thursday morning meeting. Full ops team in the conference room. Every department lead, every analyst, every project manager, 20 people seated around a polished wood table, notebooks open, eyes on the screen. Except for Greg. Greg had taken it upon himself to treat the meeting like an audition. I'd barely finished outlining the agenda before he chimed in, loud, confident, and completely off topic. Greg said, "Before we get into the weeds, I just want to throw out a few big ideas, disruption-level stuff." The room went quiet. He didn't pause. Greg said, "First off, I've been thinking about the rollout schedule. We're playing too safe. We should reverse engineer the client demand curve and flood the system early. Shock the base." He used phrases like "shock the base" as if this were a political campaign or a tech startup in a dorm room. Then he moved on, without checking if anyone understood, cared, or agreed. Greg said, "Also, the real-time data tracking, we're behind. I know because I worked on a dashboard system in my last team. I could spearhead something fast." I watched Marcus, our junior analyst, flinch slightly. He was already working on a proposal for that exact solution, and Greg knew it. But Greg didn't care, because it wasn't about solving anything. It was about being the loudest voice in the room. He interrupted Leah next, mid-sentence, just as she was citing feedback from 3 major clients. Greg said, "Honestly, clients don't always know what they need. You have to lead them, not follow them. That's basic." Leah closed her mouth. Her jaw tightened. Greg leaned back in his chair and smiled, like he'd won something, and that was when I'd had enough. I let a pause hang in the room. Let the silence do the heavy lifting. Then I leaned forward, folded my hands on the table, and locked eyes with him. I said, "Greg." He turned toward me. I said, "You've said enough. Let's hear from someone else." The words were calm, almost gentle, but they hit like a bell. A few heads turned. Someone raised an eyebrow. Leah looked down at her notes, blinking quickly. Marcus sat straighter. Greg's face flushed, pink, then red, creeping up from his collar. He opened his mouth like he might protest. I said, "I mean that. This isn't a stage. It's a strategy meeting. If you want to lead something, prove it. Otherwise, listen." He went still. I turned to Leah. I said, "Please continue." And she did, beautifully, clear, efficient, focused. She outlined the client concerns, proposed a pivot that made immediate sense, and wrapped it all up without 1 ounce of ego. The rest of the team nodded, chimed in, built on her ideas. It flowed. It worked. Greg didn't speak again for the rest of the meeting. When it ended, I stood near the door, shaking hands, making notes. One of the new hires, Mel, from accounting, passed me and whispered, "That was satisfying." I just smiled, because it was. Not just because I'd silenced him, but because I'd done it on my terms. With grace, with precision. No yelling, no drama. Just control. He told my son to shut up, dismissed him like noise, reduced a child's voice to an inconvenience, and now, in front of professionals he wanted to impress, in the one place where respect actually mattered, he got to feel what Leo felt. Diminished, dismissed, small. But unlike him, I hadn't done it to feel powerful. I'd done it to protect the room, to protect Leah, to protect Marcus, to protect every quiet voice Greg had trampled just to hear himself talk. I went back to my office, sipped my coffee, looked out the window, and I thought about how long I'd let this man walk over people. At family dinners, at holidays, in every room where Melissa nervously laughed and said, "He doesn't mean it." But he did mean it. He meant to dominate. And now, that leash was off. He was in my structure, and I didn't build it to flatter men like Greg. I built it to protect the people they try to silence. That afternoon I got a message from Marcus. He wrote, "Thank you for that today, for shutting it down. It meant more than I can say." I wrote back, "You don't have to say anything, just keep bringing your best." He replied, "I will. I feel like I finally can." I sat back and let that sink in. Greg had wanted to be heard so badly, he never stopped to ask if what he said mattered, and now, no one was listening. I wanted to believe that maybe Greg just had a loud mouth, that the problem stopped at his attitude, his dismissiveness, his interruptions, his need to dominate a room. But I was wrong. It wasn't just rudeness, it was incompetence. The kind that hides behind confidence. The kind that gets through the cracks when no one wants to make waves. After that Thursday meeting, I started looking deeper. Not because I was out for blood, but because something didn't sit right. The way he shrugged off feedback, the way he ignored instructions, the way he acted like protocol was beneath him. All of it said, "I don't think the rules apply to me." So I opened his records. At first, I focused only on the last 90 days, enough to review how he'd handled the transition. What I found made my stomach twist. Greg had missed 3 internal deadlines without explanation. One was marked as in review, but no review had taken place. Another was marked completed, but the attached file was blank. I opened the team collaboration board. His name appeared on multiple project threads, but every contribution was vague, like looping in client or finalizing deliverable. No real substance, just placeholders. Then I read the comments. One of his colleagues had written, "Greg, still waiting on the updated deck you said you'd have by Friday. Client is asking again." 3 days later, another message. Resent request. Still no file. Then under that, Greg replied, "Thought we agreed it wasn't worth updating yet. Also, I assumed Callie would handle that?" Callie had replied, clearly frustrated. "We never said that. And I've already handled my portion. Yours is the only piece missing." It wasn't one incident. It was a pattern, delegation without agreement, assumptions made in bad faith, deadlines ignored. And always, someone else left holding the bag. I kept digging. I requested a feedback summary from HR for his previous department. 2 formal complaints. 3 informal flags. Nothing had ever moved forward. In each case, the same thing happened. A colleague raised concerns about Greg's behavior, his tendency to overtalk, ignore contributions, or claim credit, and each time the issue faded without escalation. I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. He'd been doing this for years, sliding by on charm, bluster, and the benefit of the doubt. Melissa always said, "He's good at what he does." But now I knew, no, he wasn't. He just acted like he was, and no one wanted to challenge that. Until now. I didn't call him into my office right away. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted documentation. So I started a file. Every missed deadline, every deflection, every time he forwarded someone else's work with his name at the top. I even kept screenshots from Slack threads where junior team members raised concerns and Greg brushed them off. Then I waited. I gave him chances. I sent a direct email outlining expectations and reminding him of the department's workflow protocol. I wrote, "Hi, Greg. As a reminder, all deliverables must be submitted by the date listed on the central calendar. Delegation must be approved. Let me know if you need clarification." He responded, "Got it. Just been swamped. Appreciate the patience." Then, 3 days later, another deadline missed. I called him in for a check-in. He strutted in like nothing was wrong. I said, "Greg, I've reviewed your last few project contributions. There are gaps. Can you walk me through your process?" He laughed, sat down, and said, "Honestly, I think we're overcomplicating some of this. These timelines are a little tight, and I've been pulling extra weight while the new hires adjust." I raised an eyebrow. I said, "Which new hires are you supporting?" He blinked. Greg said, "Well, I mean, just in general. Answering questions, keeping things moving." I said, "Greg, you've been here for 4 weeks. You've missed 3 deadlines. You haven't submitted a single completed deliverable on your assigned projects." He leaned back, defensive now. Greg said, "I think I'm being held to a different standard." I nodded. I said, "You are. Because the standard here is accountability. You want a leadership role? This is how we evaluate leadership." He opened his mouth, then closed it. I said, "Greg, this isn't personal. This is professional. And if you can't meet the standard, I need to know now." He said nothing. I gave him 1 more week, 1 more clean slate. I made it easy, assigned him to a mid-level project with clear tasks and deadlines, alongside a team that was known for efficiency. He missed the check-in, forgot to upload his notes, and then had the audacity to complain about micromanagement. By the end of the week, the team lead sent me a quiet message. She wrote, "I hate to say it, but we're spending more time fixing Greg's messes than moving forward. He's not collaborating, he's freeloading." That was it. The file was thick enough. I closed the final document, titled it, "Greg Archer, Performance Review Summary." He thought he could fake his way through this job like he faked his way through family dinners. Talk loud, stay vague, and let someone else clean up. But I wasn't his sister-in-law anymore. I was his director. And he wasn't just rude. He was dead weight. The kind I had every right and every reason to cut loose. I wasn't surprised when HR handed me the paperwork. The file I'd compiled on Greg had been thorough. Dates, emails, missed deadlines, peer complaints, failed improvement goals. I hadn't embellished. I hadn't exaggerated. I didn't need to. He sank himself. So when I formally submitted the recommendation for a performance improvement plan, it moved fast. HR reviewed, confirmed the patterns, and scheduled the meeting. Greg sat across from me in my office, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. I went over every point, every opportunity I'd given him, every failure to meet the minimum. He said, "You're doing this on purpose. This is personal." I stayed steady. I said, "No. This is professional, and it's overdue." He didn't say another word, just took the printed plan, folded it in half, and walked out. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. Melissa. I didn't answer. She called again and again. By the fourth time, I picked up. She didn't even wait for me to say hello. Melissa said, "What the hell are you doing?" I stayed quiet. Melissa said, "Greg just called me." "You put him on some disciplinary thing? You're humiliating him at work now?" I said, "It's called a performance improvement plan. It's standard procedure." She laughed bitterly. Melissa said, "Don't you dare play the HR card with me. This is about dinner. This is about Leo. Admit it." I said, "No. This is about Greg being bad at his job. That's it." Melissa's voice cracked into a higher pitch. Melissa said, "You're using your power to take revenge. You're trying to make him look small." I leaned back in my chair. I said, "Melissa, he is small. I just finally stopped covering for it." Silence. Then a low, angry growl from her throat. Melissa said, "You've always been so self-righteous, so perfect. Now you're using your title to settle family grudges. I hope you're proud of yourself." I didn't flinch. I said, "I didn't create a file. Greg did. I just documented it." Melissa said, "You're tearing this family apart." I said, "No, Melissa. I'm protecting the people I'm responsible for, from people like him." She went quiet. And for a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she heard me. But then she said, "You've always resented me. Admit it." I didn't take the bait. I said, "If you're calling to talk about Greg's improvement plan, the conversation is over. If you're calling as my sister, maybe wait until you can hear me without screaming." And I hung up. I didn't slam the phone down. I didn't cry. I just set it gently on the desk and stared at the corner of my office wall until the tension slid off my shoulders, because I had nothing to defend. This wasn't personal. This was accountability. For once, I wasn't the one keeping the peace while someone else wreaked havoc. I wasn't biting my tongue at the dinner table. I wasn't nodding along while Melissa made excuses. I was the one drawing the line. And it felt like oxygen. Later that evening, HR pinged me. Greg had signed the paperwork, but under protest, he'd scribbled "targeted unfairly" in the margin. I didn't care, because every bullet point in that document had a paper trail. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't lost control. I had simply refused to let him skate through another space on charm and volume. I remembered something he said during his first week. Greg said, "Leadership's about confidence. People follow the loudest voice in the room." And I remember thinking, no. Leadership is about protection. It's about seeing the invisible damage loud voices cause and having the courage to say, "Not here." Greg could call it revenge if that made him feel better. Melissa could call it betrayal if that helped her sleep. But I called it something else. Boundaries. And I wasn't about to apologize for finally setting them. It ended the way these things often do. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, efficient signature. Greg's employment was terminated officially 3 weeks after the performance plan was implemented. By then, the damage was unignorable. 2 missed check-ins. 1 incomplete report filed under someone else's name. A 3rd, anonymous complaint submitted through HR. And then, his final misstep. He mocked a colleague in a Slack thread, publicly, sarcastically, over a minor correction she made to a spreadsheet formula. The message was reported, screenshotted, sent directly to me. I didn't hesitate. I sent it straight to HR and said, "This confirms a pattern." The paperwork moved fast after that. By the following Monday, the termination was official. There was no scene, no blow-up, no email blast, no dramatic exit with boxes and slammed doors. Greg came in early, as usual. He was pulled into HR around 10 a.m. I wasn't present. I didn't need to be. By 10:45, he was gone. He didn't stop by my office. He didn't ask for a second chance. He didn't say goodbye, and I didn't chase him. I had a meeting scheduled at 11 o'clock and took it like any other day. When someone mentioned his departure in passing, I said, "The department will adjust." We always do. Because we would. We weren't losing a cornerstone. We were losing a disruption. The next few weeks passed with startling ease. Projects that had stalled started flowing again. Marcus turned in 2 completed decks ahead of schedule. Leah took over client communication and immediately calmed a tense account. And the team, lighter, quieter, focused, like the room had finally exhaled. It was the right decision, I knew that. But I didn't expect what came next. It was a Thursday afternoon when I found it. A small envelope, tucked among my inter-office mail. No return address. Just my name in slanted handwriting I recognized immediately. Inside was a single piece of paper, lined, torn from a notebook. And in Greg's unmistakable, all-caps scrawl, it said, "Danielle, I was wrong. About a lot. Not writing about the job. I won't pretend I was great at it. You don't need me to admit that. But I was wrong about Leo. I crossed a line. I treated him like I treated everyone, like noise. He didn't deserve that. I'm sorry. You were right to protect him. Greg." I stared at the page for a long time. It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't make up for the dinners or the years of dismissal. It didn't undo what Leo heard when Greg barked at him. But it was something. A recognition. And maybe deep down, that's what I'd wanted most. Not a job title, not authority, just proof that someone like Greg could be taught. Melissa never followed up. Not after the performance plan, not after the termination, not after Greg left the company or after the letter arrived. She didn't call, didn't text, not even a passive-aggressive email, just silence. And I let it be. Because I'd spent enough years twisting myself into something palatable for her comfort. Enough years explaining my tone, my decisions, my boundaries. I wasn't going to explain this. I didn't fire Greg to humiliate him. I didn't make it personal. I didn't hold a grudge. I upheld a standard, one he refused to meet. And if that made people uncomfortable, well, discomfort is the price of change. I kept the letter, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of something deeper. He told my son to shut up. So I taught him how to listen. And maybe for once he actually did.